Still, I knew it would be difficult to make my way to the mayor. Men with his degree of power live within layers of protection. There are customary graceful ways to navigate these layers. Introductions and audiences, messages and rings, calling cards and ass-kissing. But with only 11 days to get my loot out of pawn, my time was too precious for that. I needed to make contact with Alvaron quickly. So I made my way to the foot of the sheer and found a small cafe that catered to a genteel clientele. I used one of my precious few remaining coins to buy a mug of chocolate and a seat with a view of the haberdashers across the street. Over the next several hours, I listened to the gossip that flowed through such places. Even better, I won the trust of the clever young boy who worked at the cafe, waiting to refill my mug if I so desired. With his help and some casual eavesdropping, I learned a great deal about the mayor's court in a short amount of time. Eventually, the shadows grew longer, and I decided it was time to move. I called the boy over and pointed across the street. Do you see that gentleman? The one in the red vest? Yes, sir. Do you know who it is? The Esquire Bergen, if it please you. I needed someone more important than that. How about the cross-looking fellow in the awful yellow hat? The boy hid a smile. That's Baronet Petour. Perfect. I stood and clapped Jim on the back. You'll do well for yourself with a memory like that. Keep well. I gave him a halfpenny and strolled to where the baronet stood, fingering a bolt of deep green velvet. It goes without saying that in terms of social rank, there are none lower than the Edema Ruh. Even leaving aside my heritage, I was a landless commoner. This meant, in terms of social standing, the baronet was so high above me that if he were a star, I would not be able to see him with the naked eye. A person of my position should address him as my lord, avoid eye contact, and bow deeply and humbly. Truth be told, a person of my social standing shouldn't speak to him at all. Things were different in the Commonwealth, of course, and the university itself was particularly egalitarian. But even there, nobility were still rich and powerful and well-connected. People like Ambrose would always run roughshod over folk like myself. And if things got difficult, he could always hush things up or bribe a judge to get himself out of trouble. But I was in Vintus now. Here, Ambrose wouldn't need to bribe the judge. If I'd accidentally jostled the Baronet Petour in the street while I was still barefoot and muddy, he could have horsewhipped me bloody, then called the constable to arrest me for being a public nuisance. The constable would have done it, too, with a smile and a nod. Let me try to say this more succinctly. In the Commonwealth, the gentry are people with power and money. In Vintus, the gentry have power and money and privilege. Many rules simply do not apply to them. That meant in Vintus, social rank was of utmost importance. That meant if the baronet knew I was below him, he would lord it over me, quite literally. On the other hand, as I walked across the street toward the baronet, I straightened my shoulders and raised my chin a bit.
Nice,
I stiffened my neck and narrowed my eyes slightly. I looked around as if I owned the entire street, and it was currently something of a disappointment. "Baronet Petour," I said briskly. The man looked up, smiled vaguely as if he couldn't decide if he recognized me or not. "Yes." I made a curt gesture toward the sheer. "You would be doing the mayor a great service if you would escort me to his estate as quickly as possible." I kept my expression stern, almost angry. "Well, certainly."
Dude.
He sounded anything but certain.
Guys, man.
I could sense the questions, the excuses beginning to bubble up in him. I fixed the baronet with my haughtiest stare. The edema might be on the lowest rung of the social ladder, but there are no finer actors breathing. I had been raised on the stage, and my father could play a king so regal I'd seen audiences doff their hats when he made his entrance. I made my eyes as hard as agates and looked the florid man up and down as if he were a horse I wasn't sure I cared to bet on. "If the matter were not urgent, I would never impose on you this way." I hesitated. then added a stiff, reluctant, "Sir." Baronet P'Tur looked me in the eye. He was slightly off balance, but not nearly as much as I'd hoped. Like most nobility, he was self-centered as a gyroscope, and the only thing keeping him from sniffing and looking down his nose at me was his uncertainty. He eyed me, trying to decide if he could risk offending me by asking my name and how we were acquainted. But I still had a final trick to play. I brought out the thin, sharp smile the porter at the Grey Man had used when I had come calling on Denna all those months ago. As I'd said, it was a good smile, gracious, polite, and more patronizing than if I'd reached out and patted the man on the head like a dog. The Baronet P'Tur bore up under the weight of the smile for almost a full second. Then he cracked like an egg, his shoulders rounding a bit, and his manner becoming ever so slightly obsequious. "Any service I can lend the mayor is a service I'm glad to render," he said. "Please, allow me." He took the lead, heading toward the foot of the cliff. Following behind, I smiled. Chapter 54. The Messenger. I managed to bluff and fast-talk my way through the majority of the mayor's defenses. The Baronet P'Tur helped me simply by his presence. Being escorted by a recognizable member of the nobility was enough to get me deep inside Alvaron's estate. After that, he soon outlived his usefulness, and I left him behind. Once he was out of sight, I put on my most impatient face, asked a busy servant for directions, and made it all the way to the outer doors of the mayor's audience chamber before I was stopped by an unassuming man in his middle years. He was portly, with a round face, and despite his fine clothes, he looked like a grocer to me. If not for the several hours I'd spent gathering information in Severin Low, I might have made a terrible mistake and tried to bluff my way past this man, thinking him nothing more than a well-dressed servant. But this was actually the person I was looking for, the mayor's manservant, Stapes. Though he looked like a grocer, he had the aura of true authority about him. His manner was quiet and certain, unlike the overbearing, brash one I had used to bully the baronet. "How can I help you?" Stapes asked. His tone was perfectly polite, but there were other questions lurking beneath the surface of his words. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" I brought out Count Threp's letter and handed it over with a slight bow. "You would be doing me a great service if you would convey this to the mayor," I said. "He is expecting me." Stapes gave me a cool look, making it perfectly clear that if the mayor had been expecting me, he would have known about it 10 days ago. He rubbed his chin as he looked me over, and I saw he wore a dull iron ring with gold letters scrolling across the surface. Despite his obvious misgivings, Stapes took the letter and disappeared through a set of double doors. I stood in the hallway for a nervous minute before he returned and ushered me inside, his manner still vaguely disapproving. We moved through a short hallway, then came to a second set of doors flanked by armored guards. These weren't ceremonial guards of the sort you sometimes see in public, standing stiffly at attention, holding halberds. They wore the mayor's colors, but beneath their sapphire and ivory were functional breastplates with steel rings and leather. Each man wore a long sword and a long knife. They eyed me seriously as I approached. The mayor's manservant nodded to me, and one of the guards manhandled me in a quick, competent way, sliding his hands along my arms and legs and around my chest, searching for hidden weapons. I was suddenly very glad for some of the misfortunes on my trip, specifically the ones that had ended with me losing the pair of slender knives I'd grown accustomed to wearing underneath my clothes. The guard stepped back and nodded. Then Stapes gave me another irritated look and opened the inner door. Inside, 2 men sat at a map-strewn table. One was tall and bald with the hard, weathered look of a veteran soldier. Next to him sat the mayor. Alvaron was older than I had expected. He had a serious face, proud around the mouth and eyes. His well-trimmed salt and pepper beard had very little black left to it, but his hair was still full and thick. His eyes, too, seemed to belie his age. They were clear gray, clever, and piercing. They were not the eyes of an old man. The mayor turned those eyes on me as I entered the room. He held Threpp's letter in one hand. I made a standard number 3 bow, the messenger, as my father called it, low and formal, as fitting the mayor's high station, deferential, but not obsequious. Just because I tread heavily on propriety's toes doesn't mean I can't play the game when it's of use to me. The mayor's eyes flickered down to the letter, then back up. "Quoth, is it? You travel swiftly to arrive in such good time. I'd not expected even a reply from the Count so soon." "I made all possible speed to put myself at your disposal, Your Grace." "Indeed." He looked me over carefully. "And you seem to vindicate the Count's opinion of your wit by making it all the way to my door with nothing but a sealed letter in your hand." "I thought it best to present myself as soon as possible, Your Grace," I said neutrally. "Your letter implied you were in some haste." "And an impressive job you did of it, too," Elveron said, glancing at the tall man sitting at the table next to him. "Wouldn't you say, Dagon?" "Yes, Your Grace." Dagon looked at me with dark, dispassionate eyes. His face was hard and sharp and emotionless. I suppressed a shiver. Elveron glanced down at the letter again. "Threpp certainly has some flattering things to say about you here," he said. "Well-spoken, charming, most talented musician he's met in 10 years. The mayor continued reading, then looked back up, his eyes shrewd. "You seem a bit young," he said hesitantly. "You're barely past 20, aren't you?" I was a month past my 16th birthday, a fact I'd pointedly omitted from the letter. "I am young, Your Grace," I admitted, sidestepping the actual lie. "But I've been making music since I was 4. I spoke with quiet confidence, doubly glad of my new clothes. In my rags, I couldn't have helped but look like a starving urchin. As it was, I was well-dressed and tanned from my days at sea, and the lean lines of my face added years to my appearance. Elveron eyed me for a long, speculative moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied. "Very well," he said. "Unfortunately, I am rather busy at present. Would tomorrow be convenient for you?" It wasn't really a question. "Have you found lodgings in the city?" What's the plan? "I have not made any arrangements as of yet, Your Grace." "Craft it." "You will stay here," he said evenly. "Stapes?" He called in a voice hardly louder than his normal speaking tone, and the portly, grocer-looking fellow appeared almost instantly. "Set our new guest somewhere in the south wing, near the gardens." He turned back to me. "Will your luggage be following?" "I fear all my luggage was lost on the way, Your Grace. Shipwreck." Elveron raised an eyebrow briefly. "What are you doing?" "Stapes will see you are properly outfitted." He folded Threpp's letter and made a gesture of dismissal. "Good evening." I made a quick bow and followed Stapes from the room. The rooms were the most opulent I'd ever seen, let alone lived in, full of old wood and polished stone. The bed had a feather mattress a foot thick, and when I drew its curtains and lay inside, it seemed as big as my entire room back at Anchor's. My rooms were so pleasant it took me almost a full day to realize how much I hated them. Again, you have to think in terms of shoes. You don't want the biggest pair. You want a pair that fits. If your shoes are too big, your feet chafe and blister. In a similar way, my rooms chafed at me. There was an immense empty wardrobe, empty chests of drawers, and bare bookshelves. My room in Anchor's had been tiny, but here I felt like a dried pea rattling around inside an empty jewelry box. But while the rooms were too large for my non-existent possessions, they were too small for me. I was obliged to remain there, waiting for the mayor to summon me. Since I had no idea when this might happen, I was effectively trapped. In defense of the mayor's hospitality, I should mention a few positive things. The food was excellent, if somewhat cold by the time it made its way from the kitchens. There was also a wonderful copper bathing basin. Servants brought the hot water, but it drained away through a series of pipes. I had not expected to find such conveniences so far from the civilizing influence of the university. I was visited by one of the mayor's tailors, an excitable little man who measured me 6 dozen different ways while chattering about the court gossip. The next day, a runner boy delivered 2 elaborate suits of clothing in colors that flattered me. In a way, I was fortunate I'd met with trouble at sea. The clothing Alvaron's tailors supplied was much better than anything I could have afforded, even with Threp's help. As a result, I cut quite a striking figure during my stay in Severin. Best of all, while checking the fit of my clothes, the chatty tailor mentioned cloaks were in fashion. I took the opportunity to exaggerate somewhat about the cloak fella had given me, bemoaning the loss of it. The result was a richly colored burgundy cloak. It wouldn't keep the rain off worth a damn, but I was quite fond of it. Not only did it make me look rather dashing, but it was full of clever little pockets, of course. So, I was dressed, fed, and boarded in luxury. But despite this largesse, by noon of the next day I was prowling my rooms like a cat in a crate. I itched to be outside, to have my loot out of pawn, to discover why the mayor needed the service of someone clever, well-spoken, and above all, discreet. Chapter 55. Grace. I peered at the mayor through a gap in the hedge. He was sitting on a stone bench under a shade tree in his gardens, looking every bit the gentleman in his loose sleeves and waistcoat. He wore the house colors of Alvaron, sapphire and ivory. But while his clothes were fine, they weren't ostentatious. He wore a gold signet ring, but no other jewelry. Compared to many others in his court, the mayor was almost plainly dressed. At first, this seemed to imply that Alvaron disdained the fashions of the court. But after a moment, I saw the truth of it.
Use a gun, bro.
The ivory of his shirt was creamy and flawless. The sapphire of his waistcoat vibrant.
Dude, there's no way he was about to throw a
I would have bet
nade.
my thumbs that they hadn't been worn more than a half-dozen times. As a display of wealth, it was subtle and staggering. It was one thing to be able to afford fine clothes, but how much would it cost to maintain a wardrobe that never showed the slightest hint of wear? I thought of what Count Threp had said about Alvaron. Rich as the king of Vint. The mayor himself looked much the same as before. Tall and thin, graying and immaculately groomed. I took in the tired lines of his face, the slight tremble of his hands, his posture. He looks old, I thought to myself.
No, he has
but he's
bullets.
not.
He killed that guy.
The belling tower began to strike the hour. I stepped back from the hedge and strolled around the corner to meet the mayor.
Nice music.
Alvaron nodded, his cool eyes looking me over carefully. Quoth, I was rather hoping you would come. I gave a semi-formal bow. I was pleased to receive your invitation, Your Grace.
Hug the left.
Alvaron made no gesture for me to seat myself, so I remained standing. I guessed he was testing my manners. I hope you do not mind our meeting outside. Have you seen the gardens yet? I haven't had the opportunity, Your Grace. I'd been trapped in my damned rooms until he'd sent for me. You must allow me to show you around.
Right,
he took hold of a polished walking stick that rested against the shade tree. I've always found that taking some air is good for whatever troubles a body, though others disagree. He leaned forward as if he would stand, but a shadow of pain crossed his face, and he drew a shallow, painful breath between his teeth. Sick, I realized. Not old. Sick. I was at his side in a twinkling and offered him my arm. Allow me, Your Grace. The mayor gave a stiff smile. If I were younger, I'd make light of your offer. He sighed. But pride is the luxury of the strong. He laid a thin hand on my arm and used my support to gain his feet. I must settle for being gracious instead.
I actually like
Graciousness
Pathfinder,
is the luxury of the wise, I said easily, so it can be noted that your wisdom lends you grace. Elveron gave a wry chuckle and patted my arm. That makes it a bit easier to bear, I suppose. Would you like your stick, Your Grace? I asked. Or shall we walk together? He made the same dry chuckle. Walk together? That's delicately put. He took the stick in his right hand, while his left hand held my arm in a surprisingly strong grip. Lord and Lady, he swore under his breath. I hate to be seen doddering about, but it's less galling to lean on a young man's arm than hobble around on my own. It's a horrible thing to have your body fail you. You never think about it when you're young.
Is there nobody?
We began to walk, and our conversation lulled as we listened to the sound of water splashing in the fountains and birds singing in the hedges. Occasionally, the mayor would point out a particular piece of statuary and tell which of his ancestors had commissioned it, made it, or, he spoke of these in a quieter, apologetic tone, plundered it from foreign lands in times of war. We walked about the gardens for the better part of an hour. Elveron's weight on my arm gradually lessened, and soon he was using me more for balance than support. We passed several gentlefolk who bowed or nodded to the mayor. After they were out of earshot, he would mention who they were, how they ranked in court, and a snippet or two of amusing gossip. They're wondering who you are, he said after one such couple had passed behind a hedge. By tonight it will be all the talk. Are you an ambassador from Reniere? A young noble looking for a rich fief and a wife to go along? Perhaps you are my long-lost son, a remnant from my wilder youth. He chuckled to himself and patted my arm. He might have continued, but he stumbled on a protruding flagstone and almost fell. I steadied him quickly and eased him onto a stone bench beside the path. Damn and bother, he cursed, obviously embarrassed. How would that have looked?
Yeah, it's in like an hour.
The mare scrabbling about like a beetle on its back. He looked around crossly, but we seemed to be alone. Would you do an old man a favor? I'm at your disposal, Your Grace. Elveron gave me a shrewd look. Are you indeed? Well, it's a little thing. Keep secretive about who you are and what your business is. It'll do wonders for your reputation. The less you tell them, the more everyone will be wanting to get from you. I'll keep close about myself, Your Grace, but I would have better luck avoiding the subject of why I'm here if I knew what it was.
That's not really a yeet.
Elveron's expression went sly.
What's good, Nova?
True, but this is too public a place. You've shown good patience so far. Exercise it a while longer. He looked up at me. Would you be so kind as to walk me to my rooms? I held out my arm. Certainly, Your Grace. After returning to my rooms, I removed my embroidered jacket and hung it in the carved rosewood wardrobe. The huge piece of furniture was lined with cedar and sandalwood, scenting the air. Large, flawless mirrors hung on the insides of the doors. I walked across the polished marble floor and sat on a red velvet lounging couch. I idly wondered how exactly one was supposed to lounge. I couldn't remember ever doing it myself. After a moment's consideration, I decided lounging was probably similar to relaxing, but with more money in your pocket.
Oh, yeah, shit.
Restless, I got to my feet and moved around the room. There were paintings on the walls, portraits, and pastoral scenes done skillfully in oil. One wall held a huge tapestry that showed a vast naval battle in intricate detail. That occupied my attention for almost half an hour. I missed my loot.
You only go down like one
It had been terribly hard to pawn it, like cutting off my hand. I'd fully expected to spend the next 10 days sick with worry, anxious that I wouldn't be able to buy it back. But without meaning to, the mayor himself had set my mind at ease. In my wardrobe hung 6 suits of clothing, fine enough for any lord. When they had been delivered to my room, I'd felt myself relax. My first thought on seeing them wasn't that I could now mingle comfortably with the court society. I thought that if worse came to worst, I could steal them, sell them to a fripperer, and easily have enough money to reclaim my loot. Of course, if I did such a thing, I would burn all my bridges with the mayor. It would render my entire trip to Severin pointless, and would embarrass Threp so profoundly that he might never speak to me again. Nevertheless, knowing I had that option gave me a thin thread of control over the situation.
You have to want it if you want to kill me.
It was enough so I could keep from going absolutely mad with worry. I missed my loot, but if I could gain the mayor's patronage, my life's road would grow suddenly smooth and straight. The mayor had money enough for me to continue my education at the university. His connections could help me continue my research into the Amir. Perhaps most important was the power of his name. If the mayor were my patron, I would be under his protection. Ambrose's father might be the most powerful baron in all of Vintus, a dozen steps from royalty. But Alvaron was practically a king in his own right. How much simpler would my life become without Ambrose endlessly spiking my wheel? It was a giddy thought. I missed my loot. But all things have their price. For a chance of having the mayor as a patron, I was willing to grit my teeth and spend a span bored and anxious without music. Alvaron turned out to be right about the curious nature of his attendant court. After he called me to his study that evening, rumor exploded like a brush fire around me. I could understand why the mayor enjoyed this sort of thing. It was like watching stories being born. Chapter 56. Power. Alvaron sent for me again the next day, and soon the two of us were strolling along the garden paths again, his hand resting lightly on my arm. "Let's head toward the south side," the mayor pointed with his walking stick. "I hear the Celes will reach full bloom soon." We took the left turning of the path, and he drew a breath. "There are two types of power, inherent and granted," Alvaron said, letting me know the topic of today's conversation. "Inherent power you possess as a part of yourself. Granted power is lent or given by other people." He looked sideways at me. I nodded. Seeing my agreement, the mayor continued. "Inherent power is an obvious thing. Strength of body." He patted my supporting arm. "Strength of mind. Strength of personality. All these things lie within a person. They define us. They determine our limits." "Not entirely, Your Grace," I protested gently. "A man can always improve himself." "They limit us," the mayor said firmly. "A man with one hand will never wrestle in the roundings. A man with one leg will never run as quickly as a man with two.
Absolutely terrible.
An Adem warrior with only one hand might be more deadly than a common warrior with two, Your Grace," I pointed out, "despite his deficiency." True, the mayor said crossly. "We can improve ourselves, exercise our bodies, educate our minds, groom ourselves carefully." He ran a hand down his immaculate salt and pepper beard. "For even appearance is a type of power, but there are always limits. While a one-handed man might become a passable warrior, he could not play a lute." I nodded slowly. "You make a good point, Your Grace. Our power has limits we can extend, but not indefinitely." Alvaron held up a finger. "But that is only the first type of power. We are only limited if we rely upon the power we ourselves possess. There is still the type of power that is given. Do you understand what I mean by granted power?" I thought a moment. "Taxes?" The mayor said, surprised. "That's a rather good example, actually. Have you put much thought into this sort of thing before?" "A bit," I admitted, "but never in these terms." "It is a difficult thing," he said, sounding pleased by my response. "Which do you think is the greater type of power?" I only had to think for a second. "The inherent, Your Grace." "Interesting. Why do you say that?" "Because a power you possess yourself cannot be taken away, Your Grace." "Ah." He raised a long finger, as if to caution me. "But we've already agreed that type of power is severely limited. Granted power has no limits."
"You suck."
"No limits, Your Grace?" Alvaron nodded his head in concession. Very few limits, then. I still didn't agree. The mayor must have seen it on my face, because he leaned toward me to explain. Let's say I have an enemy, young and strong. Let's say he has stolen something of mine, some money. Are you with me? I nodded. No manner of training will make me the match of a quarrelsome 20-year-old. So what do? I get one of my young, strong friends to go and box his ears. With that strength, I can accomplish a feat which would be otherwise impossible.
So there's just no way that I can let them
Your enemy could box your friend's ears instead, I pointed out as we rounded a corner. An arching trellis turned the path ahead of us into a shaded tunnel, thick with deep green leaves.
You're not living, bro.
Let's say I got 3 friends together, the mayor amended. Suddenly, I've been granted the strength of 3 men. My enemy, even if he were very strong, could never be as strong as that. Look to the cellars. Terribly difficult to cultivate, they tell me. We entered the shadow of the trellis tunnel, where hundreds of deep red petals blossomed in the shade of leaf and arch. The smell was sweet and tremulous. I brushed a hand across one of the deep red blooms. It was unspeakably soft. I thought of Denna. The mayor returned to our discussion. You're missing the point, anyway. The lending of strength is just a small example. Some types of power can only be given. He made a subtle gesture to a corner of the garden.
I go in there.
Do you see Comte Farland over there? If you asked him about his title, he would say he possesses it. He would claim it is a part of him as much as his own blood. A part of his blood, in fact. Almost any noble would say the same thing. They would argue their lineage imbued them with the right to rule. The mayor looked up at me, his eyes glittering in amusement. But they're wrong. It is not inherent power. It is granted. I could take away his lands and leave him a pauper on the street. Alvaron motioned me closer, and I leaned a bit. Here is a great secret. Even my title, my riches, my control over people and the land, it is only granted power. It belongs to me no more than does the strength of your arm. He patted my hand and smiled at me. But I know the difference, and that is why I am always in control. He straightened and spoke in normal tones.
This guy was the guy with the charge rifle.
Good afternoon, Comte. Lovely day to be out in the sun, wouldn't you say?
He's 1 HP.
Indeed, Your Grace. The cellars are quite breathtaking.
That was worth it.
The Comte was a heavy man with jowls and a thick mustache. My compliments. After the Comte had passed us by, Alvaron continued.
Thanks, OG.
You notice he complimented me on the cellars. I have never touched a trowel in my life. He looked sideways at me, his expression slightly smug. Do you still think inherent power is the better of the two? You make a compelling point, Your Grace, I said. However, you're a hard one to convince. One last example, then. Can we agree that I will never be able to give birth to a child? I think that is safe to say, Your Grace. Yet, if a woman grants me the right to wed her, I can give birth to a son. Through granted power, a man can make himself as fast as a horse, as strong as an ox. Can inherent power do this for you? I couldn't argue that. I bow to your argument, Your Grace. I bow to your wisdom in accepting it.
That's the worst part about Halloween?
He chuckled, and at the same time the faint ringing of the hour moved through the garden. Oh, bother, the mayor said, his expression souring. I must go take that dreadful nostrum of mine, or Codicus will be completely unmanageable for a span of days. I gave him a quizzical look, and he explained. He somehow discovered that I poured yesterday's dose in the chamber pot. Your Grace should be mindful of your health. Alvaron scowled. You overstep yourself, he snapped. I flushed in embarrassment, but before I could apologize, he waved me into silence. You're right, of course. I know my duty, but you sound just like him. One Codicus is enough for me.
Oh,
He
shit,
paused
that's
to
not a
nod
solo.
toward an approaching couple. The man was tall and handsome, a few years older than myself. The woman was perhaps 30, with dark eyes and an elegant, wicked mouth. "Good evening, Lady Hesua. I trust your father is continuing to improve." "Oh, yes," she said. "The surgeon says he should be up before the span is through." She caught my eye and held it briefly, her red mouth curving into a knowing smile. Then she was past us. I found myself sweating a bit.
Shit, he's winding up the chopper.
If the mayor noticed, he ignored it.
He's winding up the chopper.
Terrible woman. New man every span of days. Her father was wounded in a duel with Esquire Higton over an inappropriate remark.
Any SMG, any AR.
A true remark, but that doesn't count for much once the swords are out. What of the squire? Died the day after. Pity, too. He was a good man, just didn't know enough to mind his tongue.
Nah.
He sighed and looked up at the belling tower.
Maybe I was younger.
As I was saying, one physician is quite enough for me.
I don't know, I kind of hope it is.
Codicus clucks over me like a mother hen. I hate taking medicine when I'm already on the mend.
I think that map is dated.
The mayor did seem better today. He hadn't really needed the support of my arm during our walk. I sensed he only leaned on me to give us an excuse to be talking so close together.
No, I'm not, Merce.
Your improving health seems proof enough that his ministrations work to heal you, I said. Yes. His potives drive away my illness for a span of days, sometimes for months.
That could work, but...
He sighed bitterly. But they always come back. Shall I be drinking potions the rest of my life?
No, it's not even just that. It's just
Perhaps
that,
the need for them will pass, Your Grace.
I don't think that
I had hoped the same thing. In his recent travels, Codicus gathered some herbs that worked wondrous well. His last treatment left me hale for nearly a year. I thought I was finally free of it. The mayor scowled down at his walking stick. Yet, here I am.
They update the loot.
If I could aid you in any way, Your Grace, I would.
But like the loot pool is so...
Alvaron turned his head to look me in the eye. After a moment, he nodded to himself. I do believe you would, he said.
The loot, like...
How extraordinary.
Like, I don't know. The loot pool is so much...
Several conversations of a similar sort followed.
So much more variety.
I could tell the mayor was trying to get a feel for me. With all the skill learned in 40 years of courtly intrigue, he steered the conversation in subtle ways, learning my opinions, determining whether or not I was worthy of his trust. While I didn't have the mayor's experience, I was a fair conversationalist myself. I was always careful with my answers, always courteous. After a few days, a mutual respect began to grow between us. Not a friendship such as I had with Count Threp. The mayor never encouraged me to disregard his title or sit in his presence, but we were growing closer. While Threp was a friend, the mayor was like a distant grandfather, kind but older, serious, and reserved. I got the impression the mayor was a lonely man, forced to remain aloof from his subjects and the members of his court. I almost suspected he might have sent to Threp for a companion, someone clever but removed from the politics of court so he could have an honest conversation once in a while. At first, I dismissed such an idea as unlikely, but the days continued to pass, and still the mayor avoided any mention of what use he planned to put me to. If I'd had my loot, I could have passed the time pleasantly, but it still lay in Severin Low, 7 days away from belonging to the pawnshop. So there was no music, just my echoing rooms and my damnable useless idleness. As rumors about me spread, various members of the court came to visit. Some made a pretense of welcoming me. Others made a show of wanting to gossip. I even suspected there were a few attempts at seduction, but at that point in my life I knew so little of women that I was immune to those games. One gentleman even tried to borrow money from me, and I was hard-pressed not to laugh in his face. They told different stories and used different degrees of subtlety, but they were all there for the same reason, to glean information from me. However, since I was under the mayor's instructions to be tight-lipped about myself, all the conversations were brief and unsatisfying. All but one, I should say. The exception proves the rule. Chapter 57. A Handful of Iron. I met Braden on my 4th day in Severin. It was early, but I was already pacing my rooms, nearly insane with boredom. I'd had my breakfast, and it was hours before lunch. So far today, I dealt with 3 courtiers come to pry at me. I dealt with them deftly, running our conversations aground at every opportunity. "So, where are you from, my boy?" "Oh, you know how it is. One travels so." "And your parents?" "Yes, actually, I had them. 2, in fact." "What brings you to Severin?" "A coach and 4, for the most part. Though I walked a bit as well. Good for the lungs, you know." "And what are you doing here?" "Enjoying good conversation, of course. Meeting interesting people." "Really? Who?" "Why, all sorts, including you, Lord Pravik. You are quite the fascinating fellow." And so on. It wasn't long before even the most tenacious rumor-monger grew weary and left. Worst of all, these brief exchanges would be the most interesting part of my day if the mayor didn't call for me. So far, we'd conversed over a light lunch, 3 times during brief walks in the garden, and once late at night when most sensible people would be abed. Twice, Alvaron's runner woke me from a sound sleep before the sky began to color with the blue beginning of dawn's light. I know when I'm being tested. Alvaron wanted to see if I was truly willing to make myself available to him at any unreasonable hour of the day or night. He was watching to see if I would become impatient or irritated by his casual use of me. So, I played the game. I was charming and unfailingly polite. I came when he called and left as soon as he was through with me. I asked no impertinent questions, made no demands on him, and spent the remainder of my day grinding my teeth, pacing my overlarge rooms, and trying not to think about how many days I had left before the span note on my loot expired. Small wonder that a knock on that 4th day sent me scrambling for the door. I hoped it was a summons from the mayor, but at this point, any distraction would be welcome. I opened the door to reveal an older man, a gentleman down to his bones. His clothes gave him away, certainly, but more important was the fact that he wore his wealth with the comfortable indifference of someone born into it. New-made nobles, pretenders, and rich merchants simply don't carry themselves the same way. Alvaron's manservant, for example, had finer clothes than half the gentry, but despite the self-assurance Stapes possessed, he looked like a baker wearing his holiday best. Thanks to Alvaron's tailors, I was dressed as well as anyone. The colors were good on me, leaf green, black, and burgundy, with silver workings on the cuff and collar. However, unlike Stapes, I wore the clothes with the casual ease of nobility. True, the brocade itched. True, the buttons, buckles, and endless layers made every outfit stiff and awkward as a suit of mercenaries' leathers. But I lounged in it as easily as if it were a second skin. It was a costume, you see, and I played my part as only a trooper can. As I was saying, I opened the door to see an older gentleman standing in the hall.
Dude,
"So, you're Kvothe, are you?" he asked. I nodded, caught slightly off my stride. The custom in northern Vintus was to send a servant ahead to request a meeting. The runner brought a note and a ring with the noble's name inscribed. You sent a gold ring to request a meeting with a noble of higher rank than yourself, silver for someone of roughly the same rank, and iron for someone beneath you. I didn't have any rank, of course. No title, no lands, no family, and no blood. I was low-born as they come, but no one here knew that. Everyone assumed the mysterious red-haired man spending time with Alvaron was some flavor of nobility, and my origin and standing was a much-debated topic. The important thing was that I had not been officially introduced to the court. As such, I had no official ranking. That meant all the rings sent to me were iron, and one does not typically refuse a request sent with an iron ring, lest one offend one's betters. So it was rather surprising to find this older gentleman standing outside the door, obviously noble, but unannounced and uninvited. "You may call me Braden," he said, looking me in the eye. "Do you know how to play tack?" I shook my head, unsure what to make of this.
Bro, I think,
he gave a small, disappointed sigh.
For so long is actually starting to affect
"Oh, well, I can teach you.
My eyes produce enough, like...
He thrust a black velvet sack toward me, and I took hold of it with both hands. It felt as if it were full of small, smooth stones. Braden gestured behind him, and a pair of young men bustled into my room carrying a small table.
What does that mean?
I stepped out of their way, and Braden swept through the door in their wake. "Set it by the window," he directed them, pointing with his walking stick. "And bring some chairs. No, the railback chairs."
That guy literally hit me for like 10.
In a short moment, everything was arranged to his satisfaction. The two servants left, and Braden turned to me with an apologetic look on his face. "You'll forgive an old man a dramatic entrance, I hope." "Of course," I said graciously. "Please, have a seat." I gestured toward the new table by the window. "Such aplomb," he chuckled, leaning his walking stick against the windowsill. The sunlight caught on the polished silver handle wrought in the shape of a snarling wolf's head. Braden was older, not elderly by any means, but what I consider grandfather old. His colors weren't colors at all, merely ash gray and a dark charcoal. His hair and beard were pure white, and all cut to the same length, making a frame for his face. As he sat there peering at me with his lively brown eyes, he reminded me of an owl.
I got you the loot, bro.
I took a seat across from him and wondered idly how he was going to attempt to wheedle information out of me. He'd obviously brought a game. Perhaps he'd try to gamble it out of me. That would be a new approach, at least.
Kill more.
He smiled at me. An honest smile I found myself returning before I realized what I was doing. "You must have a fair collection of rings by this point," he said. I nodded. He leaned forward curiously. "Would you mind terribly if I looked them over?" "Not at all." I went into the other room and brought back a handful of rings, spilling them onto the table. He looked them over, nodding to himself. "You've had all our best gossip-mongers descend on you. Veston, Breivik, and Temenlovy have all taken a crack." His eyebrows went up as he saw the name on another ring. "Breivik twice, and none of them got a shred of anything out of you. Nothing half as solid as a whisper." Braden glanced up at me. "That tells me you are keeping your tongue tightly between your teeth, and you are good at it.
Just not
Rest assured, I'm not here in some vain attempt to pry at your secrets."
What the fuck is this guy
I didn't
doing?
entirely believe him, but it was nice to hear. I'll admit that's a relief. As a brief aside, he mentioned casually, I'll mention the rings are traditionally left in the sitting room near the door. They are displayed as a mark of status. I hadn't known that, but I didn't want to admit to it.
Watch me,
if I was unfamiliar with the customs of the local court, it would let him know I was either a foreigner or not one of the gentry. There's no real status in a handful of iron, I said dismissively. Count Threpp had explained the basics of the rings to me before I left Imre, but he wasn't from Ventus, and obviously hadn't known the fine points. "There's some truth to that," Braden said easily. "But not the truth entire. Gold rings imply those below you are working to curry your favor. Silver indicates a healthy working relationship with your peers."
What's up, Luis?
He laid the rings in a row on the table. "However, iron means you have the attention of your betters. It indicates you are desirable." I nodded slowly. "Of course," I said. "Any ring the mayor sends will be an iron one." "Exactly," Braden nodded. "To have a ring from the mayor is a mark of great favor." He pushed the rings toward me across the top of the smooth marble table. "But there is no such ring here, and that itself is meaningful." "It seems you're no stranger to courtly politics yourself," I pointed out. Braden closed his eyes and nodded a weary agreement. "I was quite fond of it when I was young.
Ghost.
I was even something of a power as these things go. But at present, I have no machinations to advance. That takes the spice from such maneuverings." He looked at me again, meeting my eyes directly.
That ghost guy, that was the guy that was
"I have simpler tastes now. I travel. I enjoy wines and conversation with interesting people. I've even been learning how to dance. He smiled again, warmly, and rapped a knuckle on the board. More than anything, however, I enjoy playing tack. However, I know few people with time or wit enough to play the game properly. He raised an eyebrow at me. I hesitated. One might assume that someone well-skilled in the subtle art of conversation could use long stretches of idle chatter to glean information from an unsuspecting victim. Braden smiled. By the names on these rings, I can tell you've seen nothing but the most gaudy and grasping of us. You're understandably skittish regarding your secrets, whatever they may be. He leaned forward. Consider this instead. Those who have approached you are like magpies. They caw and flap around you, hoping to snatch something bright to carry home with them. He rolled his eyes disdainfully. What gain is there in that? Some small notoriety, I suppose. Some brief elevation among one's gaudy, gossipy peers. Braden ran a hand over his white beard. I am no magpie. I need nothing shiny, nor do I care what gossip-mongers think. I play a longer, more subtle game. He began to work the drawstring loose on the black velvet bag. You are a man of some wit. I know this, as the mayor does not waste his time with fools. I know you either stand in the mayor's good grace, or you have a chance to gain that grace. So, here is my plan. He smiled his warm smile again. Would you like to hear my plan? I found myself smiling back without meaning to, as I had before. That would be unusually kind of you. My plan is to insinuate myself into your favor now. I will make myself useful and entertaining. I will provide conversation and a way to pass the time.
I'm from Canada. We don't know where
He spilled a set of round stones out onto the marble tabletop. Then, when your star grows ascendant in the mayor's sky, I may find myself in possession of an unexpectedly useful friend. He began to sort the stones into their different colors. And, should your star fail to rise, I am still richer by several games of tack. I also imagine it won't hurt your reputation to spend several hours alone with me, I mentioned, given that all my other conversations have been barren things not likely to last a quarter hour. There is some truth to that as well, he said, as he began to arrange the stones. His curious brown eyes smiled at me again. Oh, yes. I think I'm going to have quite a bit of fun playing with you. My next several hours were spent learning how to play tack. Even if I had not been nearly mad with idleness, I would have enjoyed it. Tack is the best sort of game. Simple in its rules, complex in its strategy. Braden beat me handily in all 5 games we played, but I am proud to say that he never beat me the same way twice. After the 5th game, he leaned back with a satisfied sigh. That was approaching a good game. You got clever in the corner here. He wiggled his fingers at the edge of the board. Not clever enough. Clever nonetheless. What you attempted is called a Brooker's Fall, just so you know. And what's the name for the way you got away from it? I call it Braden's Defense, he said, smiling rakishly. But that's what I call any maneuver when I get out of a tight corner by being uncommonly clever.
Wow.
I laughed and began to separate the stones again. Another? Braden sighed. Alas, I have an unavoidable appointment. I needn't hurry out the door, but I don't have enough time for another game. Not a proper one. His brown eyes looked me over as he began to gather the stones into the velvet bag. I won't insult you by asking if you're familiar with the local customs, Braden said. However, I thought I might give a few general pieces of advice, on the off chance they might be helpful. He smiled at me. It would be best to listen, of course. If you refuse, you reveal your knowledge of these things. Of course. I said with a straight face.
I feel like I should have got
Braden
more for that.
slid open the table's drawer and pulled out the handful of iron rings we had swept aside to clear the board for our game. The presentation of the rings implies a great deal. If they are jumbled in a bowl, for example, it implies disinterest in the social aspects of the court. He arranged the rings with their engraved names facing me. Laid out in careful display, they show you are proud of your connections. He looked up and smiled. Either way, a new arrival is usually left alone in the sitting room on some pretext. This gives them a chance to pore through your collection in order to satisfy their curiosity. Shrugging, Braden pushed the rings toward me. You have, of course, always made a point of offering to return the rings to their owners.
Dude, I feel like
he was careful not to make it into a question. Of course, I said honestly. Threp had known that much. It is the most polite thing to do. He looked up at me, his brown eyes peering owlishly from the halo of his white hair and beard. Have you worn any of them in public? I held up my bare hands. Wearing a ring can indicate a debt, or that you are attempting to curry favor. He looked at me. If the mayor ever declines to take his ring back from you, it would be an indication he was willing to make your connection somewhat more formal. And not wearing the ring would be viewed as a slight, I said. Braden smiled. Perhaps. It is one thing to display a ring in your sitting room, quite another to display it on your hand. Wearing the ring of one's better can be viewed as quite presumptuous. Also, if you wore another noble's ring while visiting the mayor, he might take it amiss, as if someone had poached you from his forest. He leaned back in his chair. I mention these things as general talking points, he said, suspecting this information is already well known to you and you are politely letting an old man ramble. Perhaps I'm still reeling from a series of numbing defeats at TAC, I said. He waved my comment away, and I noticed he wore no rings of any sort on his fingers. You took to it quickly, like a baron at a brothel, as they say. I expect you'll prove a decent challenge after a month or so. Wait and see, I said. I'll beat you the next time we play. Braden chuckled. I like to hear that. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a smaller velvet bag. I have also brought you a small gift.
Wait,
I couldn't possibly, said reflexively. You've already provided me with an afternoon's entertainment. Please, he said, pushing the bag across the table. I must insist. These are yours without obligation, let, or lien. A freely given gift. I upended the bag and 3 rings chimed into my palm. Gold, silver, and iron. Each of them had my name etched into the metal.
See, I don't mind solo queuing, but when I'm taking like minus...
I heard a rumor your luggage was lost, Braden said, and thought these might prove useful. He smiled, especially if you desire another game of TAC. I rolled the rings around in my hand, idly wondering if the gold ring was solid or simply plated. And what ring would I send my new acquaintance if I desired his company?
It's just not fun. It's just not fun anymore.
Braden said slowly. That is complicated.
You drank?
By my rash and unseemingly barging into your rooms, I have neglected a proper introduction and failed to inform you as to my title and rank. His brown eyes looked into mine seriously. And it would be terribly rude of me to inquire about such things, I said slowly, not quite sure what he was playing at. He nodded. So for now, you must assume I am without either title or rank. That puts us on a curious footing, you unannounced to the court, and myself unannounced to you. As such, it would be fitting for you to send me a silver ring if, in the future, you would like to share a lunch or graciously lose another game of TAC. I rolled the silver ring around in my fingers. If I sent it to him, rumor would get around that I was claiming a rank roughly equal to his, and I had no idea what rank that was. What will people say? His eyes danced a bit. What indeed? So the days continued to pass. The mayor summoned me for urbane chatter. Magpie nobles sent their cards and rings and were met with polite conversational rebuffment. Braden alone kept me from growing mad with caged boredom. The next day I sent him my new silver ring with a card saying, "At your leisure, my rooms." 5 minutes later, he arrived with his tack table and bag of stones.
I remember him.
He offered my ring back to me, and I accepted it as graciously as possible. I wouldn't have minded him keeping it, but as he knew, I only had the one.
Hopefully,
our fifth game was interrupted when I was summoned by the mayor, his ring of iron sitting darkly on the runner's polished silver tray. I made my apologies to Braden and hurried off to the gardens. Later that night, Braden sent me his own silver ring and a card saying, "After supper, your rooms." I wrote "Delighted" on the card and sent it back. When he arrived, I offered to return his ring. He politely declined, and it joined the rest in the bowl by my door. It sat there for everyone to see, bright silver glittering among the handful of iron.
They just double you key.
Chapter 58. Courting. The mayor had not called on me for 2 days. I was trapped in my rooms and near mad with boredom and irritation. Worst was the fact that I didn't know why the mayor wasn't calling on me. Was he busy? Had I offended him? I thought of sending him a card along with the gold ring Braden had given me. But if Alvaron were testing my patience, that could be a grave mistake. But I was impatient. I had come here to gain a patron, or at least some assistance in my pursuit of the Emir. So far, all I had to show for my time in the mayor's service was a profoundly flattened ass. If it hadn't been for Braden, I swear I would have gone frothing mad. Worse, my loot and Denna's lovely case were only 2 days away from becoming someone else's property. I had hoped by this point to have gained enough of the mayor's favor that I could ask him for the money I needed to get it out of pawn.
I have a good time.
I'd wanted him to be indebted to me, not the other way around. Once you owe something to a member of the nobility, it is notoriously difficult to work your way free of their debt. But if Alvaron's lack of summons was any indication, I seemed to be far from his good graces. I racked my memory, trying to think of what I might have said during our last conversation that could have offended him. I'd pulled a card from the drawer and was trying to think of a politic way of asking the mayor for money when a knock came at the door. Thinking it was my lunch come early, I called for the boy to leave it on the table. There was a significant pause that roused me from my reverie. I hurried to the door and was startled to see the mayor's manservant, Stapes, standing outside. Alvaron's summons had always been delivered by runner before. "The mayor would like to see you," he said. I noticed the manservant looked worn around the edges. His eyes were weary, as if he hadn't been sleeping enough. "In the garden?" "In his rooms," Stapes said. "I will take you there." If the gossiping courtiers were to be believed, Alvaron rarely received visitors in his rooms. As I fell into step behind Stapes, I couldn't help but feel relief. Anything was better than waiting. Alvaron was propped upright in his great feather bed. He seemed paler and thinner than when I'd seen him last. His eyes were still clear and sharp, but today they held something else, some hard emotion. He gestured to a nearby chair. "Quoth, come in. Sit down." His voice was weaker too, but it still carried the weight of command. I sat at his bedside, sensing the time was not appropriate for thanking him for the privilege. "Do you know how old I am, Quoth?" he said without preamble. "No, Your Grace." "What would your guess be? How old do I seem?" I caught the hard emotion in his eyes again. Anger. A slow, smoldering anger, like hot coals beneath a thin layer of ash. My mind raced, trying to decide what the best answer might be. I didn't want to risk giving offense, but flattery irritated the mayor unless it was done with consummate subtlety and skill. My last resort, then. Honesty. 51, Your Grace. Perhaps 52. He nodded slowly, his anger seeming to fade like thunder in the distance.
Dude.
Never ask a young man your age. I am 40, with a birthday next span. You're right, though. I look 50 years if I look a day. Some might even say you were being generous. His hands smoothed the bed covers absently. It's a terrible thing growing old before your time. He stiffened in pain, grimacing. After a moment, it passed, and he drew a deep breath. A faint sheen of sweat covered his face. I don't know how long I'll be able to speak with you. I don't seem to be doing very well today.
And fun.
I stood. Should I fetch Codicus, Your Grace? No, he spat. Sit down. I did. This damnable sickness has crept on me this last month, adding years and making me feel them. I have spent my life tending to my lands, but I have been lax in one regard. I have no family, no heir. Do you mean to take a wife, Your Grace? He sagged against his pillows. The rumor has finally gotten around, has it? No, Your Grace. I guessed it from what you've said in some of our conversations. He gave me a penetrating look. Truthfully? A guess and not from a rumor?
I think the Gallardo was my favorite.
Truthfully, Your Grace.
What do you guys think is the
There are rumors, a whole courtload, if you'll excuse the expression.
The Aventador.
Courtload. That's good. He smiled a thin whisper of a smile.
Dude,
But most of it concerns some mysterious visitor from the west. I performed a small seated bow. There's nothing of marriage. Everyone sees you as the world's first bachelor. Ah, he said, his face showing his relief. That used to be the case. My father tried to marry me off when I was younger. I was rather strong-headed about not taking a wife at the time. That's another problem with power. If you possess too much, people don't dare point out your mistakes. Power can be a terrible thing. I imagine so, Your Grace. It takes away your choices, he said. It gives a man opportunities, but at the same time, it takes others away. My situation is difficult, to say the least. Over the course of my life, I've been hungry too many times to feel much empathy for the nobility. But the mayor looked so pale and weak as he lay there that I felt a flicker of sympathy. What situation is that, Your Grace? Alvaron struggled to sit upright against his pillows. If I am to be married, it must be to someone suitable, someone from a family well-positioned as my own. Not only that, but this cannot be a marriage of alliance. The girl must be young enough to... He cleared his throat, a papery noise. Produce an heir. Several, if possible. He looked up at me. Do you begin to see my problem? I nodded slowly. Just the bare shape of it, Your Grace. How many such daughters are there? A bare handful, Alvaron said, a hint of the old fire coming back to his voice. But it can't be one of the young women the king has under his control, bargaining chips and treaty sealers. My family has fought to hold our plenary powers since the founding of Vintus. I won't negotiate with that bastard Roderick for a wife. I won't remit a grain of power to him. How many women are beyond the king's control, Your Grace? 1. The word fell like a lead weight. And that is not the worst of it.
Try to shoot me in the back and then run.
The woman is perfect in every way. Her family is respectable. She is educated, young, beautiful. The last word seemed to come hard to him. She is pursued by a flock of love-struck courtiers, strong young men with honey on their tongues. They want her for every reason. Her name, her land, her wit. He gave a long pause. How will she respond to the courting of a sick old man who walks with a stick when he can walk at all? His mouth twisted, as if the words were bitter. But surely your position, I began. He lifted a hand and looked me squarely in the eye. Would you marry a woman you had bought? I looked down. No, Your Grace. Neither will I. The thought of using my position to persuade this girl to marry me is distasteful. We were quiet for a moment. Outside the window, I watched two squirrels chase each other around the tall trunk of an ash tree. Your Grace, if I'm going to help you pay court to this lady... I felt the heat of the mayor's anger before I turned to see it. I beg pardon, Your Grace. I've overstepped myself. Is this another one of your guesses, then? Yes, Your Grace. He seemed to struggle with himself for a moment. Then he sighed, and the tension in the room faded. I must ask your pardon. This clawing pain wears my temper thin, and it is not my custom to discuss personal matters with strangers, much less have them guessed from underneath me. Tell me the rest of what you guess. Be bold if you must. I breathed a little easier. I guess you want to marry this woman, to suit your duty primarily, but also because you love her. There was another pause, not so bad as the last one, but tense nonetheless. Love, he said slowly, is a word the foolish use too often. She is worthy of love, that is certain, and I have a fondness for her. He looked uncomfortable. That is all I will say. He turned to look at me. Can I count on your discretion?
Uh-oh. Somebody's mad.